Hello everyone, I'm Lauren and welcome to another video from the Tiny Menagerie. If you've got a nice little school of Glowlight Danios in your tank and they've matured and they're looking really good and you'd like to add to their number, then you may well be thinking about spawning them. Sadly, I'm spawning mine for a very different reason, and that's because I only have one female at the moment and she has somehow managed to break her back right before her tail. The tail flukes are completely paralysed, and while she's been fine for the last month, I'm now noticing quite a strong decline in her, and I'm pretty sure she's not going to be around for very much longer. I'd like to continue her line while I can, and so I'm going to get her to spawn while she still has the strength. And then I will raise the fry. Luckily, spawning Glowlight Danios is a fairly straightforward process, not as easy as Zebra or Celestial Danios, but it's still up there with the easier egg-laying fish to breed. Anyway, this is going to be the first instalment of a little mini-series about breeding Glowlight Danios, and today we're going to cover sexing through to spawning, and then there'll be an update later on the year as the fry grow on. But without further ado, here is how I spawn my Glowlight Danios. So there's not much point trying to breed your fish unless you're pretty certain you've got at least one male and female. Unfortunately though, telling the difference between the sexes isn't hugely obvious with glowlights until they're getting ready to spawn, at which point the dominant male will become very much more strongly coloured, and the female will start swelling with eggs, although nowhere nearly as noticeably as other Danio species. When she's very close to spawning though, you should be able to see her ovipositor showing just past her rounded sort of belly. For me though, the best way to tell when my fish have spawning in mind is to watch the male. Glowlights have a slight pecking order between them, and quite often they will chase each other around, but when one of the females is getting ready to spawn, which they do so roughly every 9 or 10 days, then he will become markedly more dominant, and every Danio looking fish in the tank is going to get a good chasing. He will have his strongest colours on, and he will particularly be showing a lot of red, and he will act like he is on a bit of a warpath. Basically, if your male is behaving like a complete jerk and your female is looking a bit podgy, then it's time to set up that breeding tank. Just to point out as well, I find that once the male has started behaving like this, they're going to spawn within a day, so it's a good idea to have everything set up beforehand. For the actual breeding tank, I use a 20 litre tank. It's got exactly the same water in it from the main tank where the glowlights are at the moment, but I've set it to about 2 degrees cooler. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the glowlights from the main tank and literally just plop them into this new one. No acclimatizing time at all. This drop in temperature combined with the change of locations simulates the period of flash flooding that they would get in their native habitat, and this is what is going to induce them into spawning. The tank is also very densely planted, as you can see. I've got my favourite breeding log in here with its huge ugly lump of Christmas moss growing on it. And the ground is a very coarse gravel, lots of big stones in there, and there's loads of moss growing on these steel mesh pads as well. It makes the tank look really quite crowded, and I've done this for 2 reasons. Firstly, I am only adding a trio to this tank, and as Danios are a schooling fish, they are not going to like being in such small numbers. Having all of this plant matter in there is what I can do to make them as comfortable as I possibly can. Glowlight Danios are actually group spawners, so if you have more females then you can add all of them into the tank. Just make sure you've got a ratio of roughly 2 males to every female, bearing in mind as well that each female is going to produce between 5 and 50 eggs. So make sure you've got the setup ready to cope with the number of fry you could potentially receive. As my female is in a very bad way, I am only expecting a very small number of eggs, if any, from her. In fact, if she can just replace herself, that would be absolutely ideal. I can then breed her daughter to get more fish. The other reason the tank is densely planted is all of the lovely free food that's going to come from these plants. They are full of infusoria and little microworms. All these white dots you can see on the glass are tiny little creatures that the fry are going to be able to feed on between meals. This is going to keep them as well fed as possible, and it's also going to give them a nice varied diet, which is only going to help increase their survival rate. The moss growing on stainless steel mesh down on the gravel is because Glowlight Danios can be very random about where they decide to spawn. They are quite a secretive fish, and they like to hide away and spawn against something like a rock or some driftwood, but they will also sometimes spawn in plants. By having the moss on mesh and on large stony gravel, I'm just trying to maximise the chances that those eggs are going to fall to somewhere where the adults won't be able to get them, because if they do, as with many Danio species, they will eat them. Another thing you'll note is that I don't have a filter in this tank, and in all honesty, given how I raise my fry in small batches with lots and lots of plants, I really don't find I need a filter. I stopped using filters years ago in my fry tanks, and I did this when I accidentally lost some fry to a filter whose cover had come off. Obviously I switched it off, and I honestly thought that those fry would die in there not having the filter. Everything I had read said you must have a filter. But you know what? They were absolutely fine. Fry have such a tiny little bioload that the plants can very easily take it up. And so for the first couple of months now, I just use plants, mosses in fact, because they're so easy to move around. By the time the fry are big enough to need a filter, they're also going to be big enough to need to go into a grow out tank anyway. But this is very much just me and how I raise fry. If you want to use a filter for peace of mind, absolutely do so, just make sure it's a nice gentle sponge filter. So, I know for a fact I am not going to see these fish spawn. 1, because they're very secretive, and 2, because they tend to spawn in the middle of the day and I'm going to be at work at that time. And so I am going to judge whether they've spawned or not by their behaviour. Basically, because the male is so aggressive at the moment and the female is showing her ovipositor, I know that they are going to spawn very soon. There is no other reason why they would be behaving like this. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to assume that they have spawned. I know they haven't spawned yet because otherwise things would have calmed down, and so I'm going to move them into their breeding tank and I will remove them again in exactly 3 days. This is important because if the female hasn't spawned by day 3, she's not going to. There's absolutely no point keeping them stressed in this small tank. They might as well go back home and we will try again in a couple of weeks. Also because after 3 days, assuming the female laid on the first day, then those eggs would be starting to hatch, and so the adults need to be removed before the fry start to appear, otherwise they're going to get eaten. So it's now 3 days later, and the adults have been removed, and so now the waiting game begins. 2 days later, no sign of any fry yet, but the snails are definitely breeding in there and they have cleaned the moss very nicely. It's the next day and we've got 3 little fries stuck to the side of the glass. So it's 6 days after the adult was put in the tank. I can assume the female spawned on that first evening that she was put in there. There may be more fry in here hiding in amongst the plant life. I'd be surprised if there was, to be honest. I'm pretty surprised there's any in there at all. Either way though, it has worked and I am super pleased because it means I can continue my Glowlight line. Hopefully as well, fingers crossed, at least one of these is a girl, otherwise I now have an awful lot of male Danios. And if there is a girl in there, of course, she can take over from her mother. I am supremely happy with the result. I wasn't really sure my female was going to be strong enough to have any eggs, and now I have a chance to continue them, and I'll keep you updated on the progress of these lucky little fry. Anywho, I hope you've enjoyed this little video about how I get my Glowlight Danios to spawn. Happy fish keeping everyone, and I will see you again soon. Bye bye!